Great, thank you, Vic. So everyone, good morning again. My name is Harper Schwartz, and I'm an analyst on the Maternal and Child Health team here at the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, or ASTHO. And I would like to welcome you to today's ASTHOConnect webinar on lead exposure and impacts on early brain development. Today we will discuss the developmental implications of lead exposure and analyze the long-term impacts on child outcomes. We will learn about the role of early intervention in improving outcomes for children who have been lead poisoned. And finally, we will explore the Illinois Department of Public Health lead poisoning prevention policy and programmatic efforts and opportunities for state health department staff to work in the area of lead prevention. Today, we will be hearing from three presenters. Deanna Dorica is the Director of the Lead Poisoning Prevention and Healthy Homes Unit at the Cook County Department of Public Health in Illinois. She provides strategic direction to the unit, implementing both program improvements and policy systems and environmental changes that advance health equity. Dr. Nicole Hamp, or Nikki, is completing her pediatric residency at the University of Chicago and will be starting her fellowship in developmental behavioral pediatrics at the University of Michigan in July. Over the past 3 years, Dr. Hamp has served as the head physician on an early intervention and lead work group that's convened by the Legal Council for Health Justice with the aim of achieving automatic eligibility for early intervention services for children in Illinois who have been lead exposed. Amy Zimmerman is the Director of Children and Families Partnerships at Legal Council for Health Justice. In her role, Amy oversees child health programming and policy initiatives tackling health disparities among children and families. And you can find these three full bios in the chat box. Lead exposure is an ongoing problem in the United States that can result in detrimental effects on early brain development. ASTHO works closely with federal agencies and state health departments to support initiatives addressing early brain development through state and system-level policy change. Before we hear from our speakers today, I would like to turn it over to Cherise Walcott, Public Health Advisor in the Office for State, Tribal, Local, and Territorial Support, for brief remarks on behalf of the CDC. Cherise, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cherise Walcott, CDC's Center for State, Tribal, Local, and Territorial Support in our Division of Performance Improvement Field Services and our Performance Development Evaluation and Training branch. I'm glad to be joining you all on this webinar today. I personally appreciate the opportunity to work with our ASTHO partners on this important project. CDC's Early Brain Initiative is inclusive of work that influences brain structure and function over the course of the lifespan, from before conception through early childhood. Much of this work is focused on promoting and protecting brain health, promoting in the areas of early interventions for medical and biological issues, positive parenting and caregiving, nutrition and activity, preventing in the areas of hazardous exposures, adverse childhood experiences, infections, injuries, all accounting for or addressing the social determinants and context of health. By conducting robust science, surveillance, and service, we anticipate achieving outcomes like enhancing learning, socio-emotional, language, and cognitive skills, healthy stress response, not hyper-responsive or chronically activated, just overall healthy developmental outcomes, and positive intergenerational effects. The policies, programmatic efforts, and promising practices that we'll hear about today on addressing lead exposure and poisoning are vital to achieving these outcomes. So I really look forward to hearing from our speakers today. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Cherise. I would now like to turn it over to our presenters. We will wait to answer questions until the very end of this presentation, but we welcome you to chat your questions into the chat box. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. Nikki, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Great. Thank you so much, Harper, for your introduction. This is Nikki Hamp. Hi, everyone. Let's just go ahead and get started. Next, please. That's us again. Once again, I'm Nikki Hamp. I'm going to be doing this webinar today with Amy Zimmerman and Deanna Dorica. Next. So our objectives for today are for you to first recognize the sources of lead poisoning, understand how lead poisoning occurs, and why children are more susceptible to the effects of lead than adults are. Second, to understand the developmental implications of lead exposure and to be able to analyze the long-term impacts on child outcomes. Third, to describe the role of early intervention in improving outcomes for children who have been lead poisoned. And finally, to appreciate the Illinois Department of Public Health proactive lead poisoning prevention policy and programmatic efforts. Next. Despite legislation to remove lead from paint in the early 1970s, lead poisoning remains a prevalent yet preventable public health concern. Water as a source of lead poisoning has been getting a lot of press lately, and it certainly is a significant source of exposure given that lead pipes and plumbing were permitted for use in some areas in construction as recently as 1986. However, still, by far the most common source of exposure to lead is paint. Lead-based paint remains present in homes and buildings built before the 1970s in which proper abatement or mitigation has never been pursued. While peeling paint chips are of course a concern, it is actually the dust from lead paint that is the biggest hazard. This is further exacerbated by unsafe renovation and remodeling practices and is a significant concern in poorly maintained homes. Dust typically accumulates in the corners of door and window frames and on porch desks. Other important sources of exposure include the dirt, soil, and gravel near major roadways due to leaded gasoline that wasn't completely phased out until the 1990s, the ground at sites of previously demolished homes and public housing that once contained lead paint, and consumer products, both foreign and domestic. Next. Another source of exposure that is often forgotten is from mom, as lead can be transferred to a mother's unborn baby if she is exposed to lead during pregnancy. This can lead to prematurity, low birth weight, and or delayed or slowed growth. It also puts the baby at risk for miscarriage. Next. While lead poisoning is certainly not just a pediatric issue, children are at a much greater risk of lead exposure and the toxic effects of lead as compared to adults. Next. Children are at increased risk of lead poisoning for several reasons. First, they have increased exposure. So from a behavioral perspective, they have increased exposure because they are on the ground. They are crawling, exploring their environment, and practicing hand-to-mouth behavior. From a physiologic perspective, they have increased exposure because they actually have higher baseline breathing rates than adults do. So they inhale more lead dust than adults. Second, following ingestion, children absorb more lead from the GI tract than adults. They can absorb up to 70% of the lead that has been ingested, whereas adults only absorb about 20%. They also have an immature blood-brain barrier, allowing lead from the blood to more easily enter the brain and impact the developing nervous system. And finally, once absorbed, children retain more lead than adults. Children younger than 2 years of age retain approximately 1/2 of all absorbed lead, whereas adults retain only about 1%. So for children, even a one-time exposure can cause significant harm. Next. Those at highest risk for lead exposure include children less than 6 years of age, particularly those between 12 and 36 months, those with persistent oral behaviors, those with poor hygiene or poor nutrition, also children living in urban low-income households, children from minority families, and of course those residing in deteriorating pre-1970s housing. The graphic to the right of the slide really highlights how lead poisoning is a true health disparities issue. The graph shows data from the 2016 Illinois surveillance report, which found that 3.2% of Black children compared to 1.6% of white children had a blood lead level at or above 5 micrograms per deciliter, meaning that a Black child was 200% more likely to have a lead level of 5 and up. Additionally, 0.8% of Black children compared to 0.5% of white children tested had a blood lead level of 10 or more, meaning a Black child was 1.6 times more likely to have a lead level of 10 and up. Next. Over time, the understanding of how much lead is safe has changed. We have long known that lead is toxic to the body at high levels because at these levels there are outward symptoms of lead poisoning. However, since the 1970s, a growing body of research demonstrates that lead causes irreversible, asymptomatic effects far below levels previously considered safe. Today, we know that there is no safe level of lead exposure, and even very small amounts can cause irreversible damage, though that damage may not be immediately clear. In the U.S., the reference level of blood lead is the level at which public health actions are recommended to be initiated. It is determined by the CDC and is in part based upon the understanding of complications caused by a given concentration of lead in the blood. Consistent with the research, the CDC lowered incrementally the reference level of lead from 60 in the 1960s to 5 in 2012. While the CDC sets a federal reference level, states can choose the level at which they decide to actually offer services. For example, Illinois' reference level was set at 10 micrograms per deciliter. However, last year, legislation was passed to lower the Illinois lead reference value to 5, consistent with the CDC. Next. So what does lead poisoning actually look like? Next. As mentioned previously, at high levels, lead poisoning is overtly symptomatic. Symptoms of high-level lead toxicity include loss of appetite, irritability, fatigue, abdominal pain, constipation, vomiting, hearing loss, and seizures. High levels of lead in the blood can even lead to coma and death. However, most children who have been lead exposed never show these symptoms because most are exposed to lower levels of lead that, at least initially, leave them asymptomatic. Next. Over time, children exposed to low levels of lead may develop deficits in overall intellectual ability, speech and language processing, visual spatial skills, attention, executive functioning and social skills, and fine and gross motor skills. These deficits typically don't become apparent until a child is around school age and has to engage in a higher level of executive functioning. Often by then, it can be too late to intervene. Next. The deficits caused by lead were first documented in 1979 by Dr. Herbert Needleman, a pediatrician in Massachusetts. His groundbreaking study highlighted the correlation between lower-level childhood lead exposure and neurocognitive deficits. Dr. Needleman looked at the level of lead in the lost teeth of children between the ages of 6 and 7 years, and then evaluated the performance in the first and second grade. He found that the ones with a history of higher levels of lead exposure had lower intelligence scores, impaired speech and language processing, decreased attention, and worse classroom performance. When the children were re-examined in the 5th grade, children with a history of higher level lead exposure still had lower IQ scores than their peers, needed more special education services, and had higher rates of school failure. Next. 11 years later, Dr. Needleman re-examined some of the children from the original study and found that deficits persisted for those with higher levels of lead exposure. Those with higher levels of exposure were 7 times more likely to be high school dropouts, 6 times more likely to have a reading disability, and for those that stayed in high school, a lower class standing and higher rates of absenteeism. Next. Other studies have proven a measurable and statistically significant difference in IQ for children with elevated blood lead levels. For example, one study by Dr. Richard Canfield from Cornell University demonstrated IQ decreases by about 4.6 points for every 10 microgram per deciliter increase in the lifetime average blood lead concentration. However, when blood lead levels are less than 10, the loss of IQ points for every 1 microgram increase in blood lead concentration is considerably greater, nearly 3 times the loss. So if you just concentrate on the lower levels of lead exposure, you see that IQ declines by about 7.5 points for a lifetime average blood lead concentration of up to 10 micrograms per deciliter. Next. Other studies have looked at the effect of lead on academic achievement. For example, a study released in 2015 by Ann Evans and colleagues looked retrospectively at blood lead concentration and 3rd grade Illinois Standard Achievement Test reading and math scores in over 58,000 Chicago-born children. The study found that for children with a blood lead level below 10, a 5 microgram increase in lead level was associated with a 32% greater likelihood of failing a 3rd grade reading or math exam. Next. And I find this to be a rather shocking and scary statistic. Studies have actually shown over a 4 times increased risk of ADHD for children with blood lead levels of greater than 2, with approximately 1 in 5 cases of ADHD in the United States being attributable to low-level lead exposure. These numbers are impressive and are cited by the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Environmental Health. Next. Finally, while there are many other studies pointing to many other deficits caused by lead, the last few that I would like to point out are those that link elevated blood lead levels in childhood to increased risk of delinquent and criminal behavior later in life. One study found that a child between the ages of 8 and 15 years old with a lead level of greater than 1.5 has an 8 times greater chance of being diagnosed with a conduct disorder than a child in this age cohort with a blood lead level of less than 0.7. Another study found that every 5 microgram per deciliter increase in lead level at the age of 6 increases a child's chances of being arrested for a violent crime as a young adult by around 50%. Next. So to sum up, there are significant effects of low-level childhood lead exposure that include but are not limited to decreased IQ, decreased cognitive performance, worse academic performance, impaired executive functioning, increased rates of reading disabilities and utilization of special education resources, increased incidence of ADHD and behavioral or mood disorders, and increased delinquency. It goes without saying that all of these things have significant effects on a child's future, including impaired academic performance, decreased employment, lower socioeconomic status, increased arrest, and ultimately decreased quality of life. This in turn also leads to profound costs to society, and yet at the moment, because primary prevention strategies to prevent future lead exposure, besides primary prevention strategies to prevent future lead exposures, as a society and as a country, we really do not do much for the children and families who have already been exposed to lead. Next. While it is true that primary prevention and education are key to preventing future generations from exposure, both have proven to be long-term uphill battles that have been fought for decades and will likely continue for decades more. In the meantime, our children continue to be poisoned by lead. We need intervention strategies now that work on mitigating the effects of lead exposure for the thousands of children who have already been exposed. Next. So how do we do that? Well, in this picture, we are looking at stained sections of neurons from the brain. You can see that on the left, the brain of a newborn has far fewer neural connections than the 2-year-old brain on the right. That's because in early childhood, there is robust brain growth and a period in which the effective neural connections are strengthened and the weak ones die away. This is an important developmental step and is thought to be largely dependent on input from the environment, meaning that a child's experiences at this age can greatly impact the extent of neurodevelopment in various parts of the brain. For a child whose neural connections may be slowed or damaged by lead exposure, this neuroplasticity is key because it means that with the right intervention, that child's brain may be able to adapt and find ways to make up for any damage that has been done. Early intervention services offered between birth and 3 years of age take advantage of a time in a child's life when there is incredible neuroplasticity that may allow them to compensate for the insult. Though we cannot undo the damage that has been done, we can give children who have been lead exposed and their families the skills, the education, and the opportunity to work around it. Next.
Thank you, Dr. Hamp. This is where access to early intervention services comes in. EI is a federal program established pursuant to Part C of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. Congress created EI back in 1986 to enhance the development of infants and toddlers with disabilities, minimize potential developmental delay, and reduce educational costs by decreasing the need for special education services. Early intervention serves children from birth until they age out at age 3. Every state has an EI program. However, it may not be called early intervention like it is in Illinois. It may have a different name, such as early on in Michigan. There are strict obligations pursuant to federal law around child find, referral, intake, evaluation, eligibility, creation and implementation of the service plan, eligibility review, and ultimately transition out of the program at age 3 to school or community-based services. Many of you may already be familiar with EI and are already making those referrals to EI through the programs you work in. In Illinois, there are 25 Child and Family Connection, or CFC offices across the state, which serve as the initial program entry point. EI is available to all eligible children and their families, regardless of income or immigration status. If you are interested in reading more about the federal early intervention requirements, they can be found at 34 CFR Part 303. Next. There are three categories of eligibility for early intervention. Our goal is to have children who are lead exposed eligible under the first category, which is for children who are experiencing a medically diagnosed physical or mental condition that has a high probability of resulting in developmental delay, like Down syndrome. All states must serve these children. The second eligibility category is for children experiencing a delay in one or more of the following domains: cognitive, physical, social-emotional, communication, or adaptive. All states are allowed to set the level of delay that qualifies for services. In Illinois, that level is a 30% delay. The third is for children who are at risk of substantial developmental delay due to risk factors. This category is optional for states. Next. Early intervention supports families to promote their child's optimal development by encouraging, collaborating, and building plans and strategies around family activities and into daily routines. Services take place in what is referred to as the child's natural environment, generally meaning in their home or childcare. This slide is a listing of the services early intervention offers. It is a broad array of therapeutic supports. In Illinois, the most commonly utilized are speech, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and developmental therapy. As you can see, nutrition and social work are included, and may be services that would be particularly beneficial for children with lead poisoning. Next. A goal of early intervention is to minimize potential effects of developmental delays and decrease the need for special education services later in life. And the NEALS study plus state and national yearly reporting demonstrate EI success. NEALS was a longitudinal national study that looked at over 3,000 EI enrollees in 20 states. But every year, state and national reporting demonstrates that the majority of children in EI exceed growth expectations based on their prognosis in all measured fields: social relationships, knowledge and skills, ability to take action to meet needs. And 50% or more exit EI meeting age-level expectations in at least one of these three measured fields. Next. The NEALS study also demonstrated impressive results for family outcomes based on self-report surveys. Additionally, all states collect and yearly report information about how well Part C programs are serving families. Consistently in Illinois and nationally, over 90% of families report positive family outcomes. Next. Even though we know that EI is likely to help mitigate the negative effects of lead poisoning, children with lead poisoning are not automatically eligible for EI services in all states. Given what we have learned about the impacts of lead exposure, combined with EI's positive track record of developmental gain and positive family outcomes for eligible children, it is imperative that we consider EI for lead-poisoned children, whether or not they are currently exhibiting delay. In Illinois, we are working on this through a pilot taking place in 3 communities and currently have legislation pending, SB 155, that will establish automatic eligibility under the medical diagnosis category. We can offer EI services to lead-exposed children because more than 10 years ago, IDEA Part C federal regulations were amended to allow states to include, quote, disorders secondary to exposure to toxic substances, unquote, as an example of a condition that states may adopt for children to automatically qualify for EI services. By offering these services, we have a unique opportunity to intervene early and change the trajectory of children's life. We believe that early childhood programs like early intervention can be the answer. Next. As part of our EI and lead work, we did a literature review that included charting the definitions of every state that explicitly or implicitly recognized lead as part of their EI eligibility definition. 18 states have auto-eligibility for lead-exposed children as a medical condition with a high probability of developmental delay. though the cutoffs vary widely, as you can see by the definitions. Part of the literature review also involved reviewing states implementing rules and regulations and reaching out to EI program administrators to learn what types of services children who enter EI due to lead exposure receive. We were surprised that we could not find a state that had any specific guidance around service provision, and when we reached out to states, we were often met with responses that ranged from surprise that lead was included in their eligibility criteria to responses that children who were lead exposed while eligible for EI receive services only once delays manifest. However, we decided that eligibility without services would be meaningless. While we recognize, While we recognize that due to the risk profile, of many children with elevated blood levels, a significant number of them may have delays that without automatic eligibility would not be enough to qualify them for the program, such as a 20% speech delay rather than a 30% delay in Illinois. But that isn't sufficient. In the pilot, we are also rethinking intervention, starting with training providers to pivot to a proactive service provision model from a deficit-driven one, in order to lessen or even prevent the delays that we know so many lead-exposed children can manifest later. We are also developing a service guidelines document to equip early interventionists with information that will help them reinforce the public health, nurse, and environmental messaging around lead in order to help prevent re-exposure. Next. These are the remaining state definitions we found. If you see information about your state that we need to update, I would appreciate it if you would contact me. This is Amy Zimmerman, and our contact information is at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. Next. With grant funding, we are piloting automatic eligibility for young children who have been lead exposed in select Illinois communities with two primary goals. First, to understand the efficacy of the service guidelines, trainings, and educational materials to effectively prepare EI providers to serve lead-exposed children and their families, and efforts needed to best inform physicians of the benefits of EI for lead-poisoned children, support them to make successful referrals, which require venous testing, and to engage families to participate in EI. A second goal is to evaluate the impact of EI services on the developmental trajectory of lead-exposed children and on the capacity of their parents to support and advocate for them. Regarding the service guidelines document, it covers such topics as neurodevelopmental impacts of lead, best practices in supporting child development and building parent capacity, public health obligations, lead testing and nutrition guidelines, tenant rights, and tips to reduce risk of lead exposure. As the pilot proceeds, there will be opportunities to both modify and enhance the guidelines to ensure that they are as useful as possible to providers working with children who've been lead exposed. Once Illinois moved to statewide rollout, we want practitioners to feel supported in this work, and we want this document to be usable by other home-based providers, such as McVie and Head Start home visitors. Next. Our next steps include continuing with pilot enrollment, service provision, evaluation, and development of service guidelines. We are also working on passage of SB 155 during this legislative session. We've been especially impressed by the significant public health department support for automatic eligibility. In Illinois, lead-poisoned children generally only receive one nurse home visit. Public health practitioners truly understand the benefits of having another informed professional in the home, working with the family and helping to reinforce their message around lead poisoning prevention. Lastly, it is our goal to establish a national learning collaborative to inform and influence expansion of early intervention for lead-exposed children across the United States. And if this is something you feel your state would be interested in, please contact us. Next.
Okay, so how else has Illinois been working to ensure that the public health response is informed by the science of brain development? Next. Next, please. As we've talked about, Illinois has adopted the CDC reference value as the level at which public health nurse intervention and environmental home inspections begin for both children and pregnant women. This allows our local health departments to provide nurse home visits to exposed children and pregnant women at blood lead levels of 5 micrograms per deciliter and greater, and it gives us the authority to inspect homes and enforce remediation of lead paint hazards where those exposed children and pregnant women reside. We're excited about expanding our services to address lower blood lead levels. We're preventing children and women from further lead exposure and making our practice more closely aligned with what science tells us is the right thing to do. To support the work in our state, Illinois is participating in a maternal-child environmental health collaborative improvement and innovation network, supported by HRSA and led by ASTHO, AMCHIP, the National Institute for Children's Health Quality, NASHB, NEHA, and the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative. In this multi-state learning collaborative, we are working on improving screening for children in high-risk priority communities and for pregnant women throughout the state. With that work, we are creating and updating screening tools and educational materials for both providers and families so that they better understand the risks that lead exposure presents and the importance of screening and testing. And this work is really driven by data that we've gathered through surveys of providers. We've surveyed them to try to understand what they do and what they need regarding lead, and have found that many do not know what their responsibilities are for screening and testing children and pregnant women. In Illinois, the rules for who is tested and when you need to screen and test is complex. A child's zip code, their income, the age of their housing, recent housing risks like any renovations that may have happened, all play a part in whether or not a blood lead test should be performed. And this can be very confusing for providers. We know we can't help lead-exposed children if we can't find them. So we're working hard to provide better education to take the guesswork out of blood lead testing for kids and women by updating the assessment questionnaire and the testing algorithm. This is helpful for local health departments too. Our nurses are often in the position of needing to educate providers on testing requirements and medical management for lead-exposed children and their families. So any clear, up-to-date, easy-to-understand materials makes for better communication and better management of children. Next. Understanding lead's effects on early brain development can also help to drive shared agendas among health providers, social service providers, early care providers, and those in the education world. When we talk brain development, we speak the same language as our early care and education partners, and more our elementary school partners too. When we use the same lens and highlight the ways that lead exposure has a real profound effect on the outcomes that they care about and are responsible for, like third grade test scores, it really changes the conversation. When I talk to educators about safe housing, then I'm framing it with my agenda. But when I talk about test scores and behavior issues, then I'm talking about the issues that affect them day to day. The science allows us to identify where our priorities are the same and where working together means wins for both of us. Next. So policy change has really underpinned all of this practice change, and we're excited about our successes. As we've talked about, interventions in Illinois now begin at that lower blood lead level, the CDC reference value of 5 micrograms per deciliter. The policy change that makes this practice possible began in the summer of 2018 in response to changes made to the Illinois Lead Poisoning Prevention Act. At that time, the Illinois Department of Public Health adopted the CDC reference value as the level at which public health nurse interventions would begin, only nurse interventions. It didn't lower the level at which environmental services, those lead risk assessments, would occur. At that time, there was a lot of discussion about how implementing environmental services at that level would be really costly. More trained and licensed staff would be needed to meet the need for more home investigations. Anyone working in this field knows how difficult it can be to balance good public health with what we can afford. In the rulemaking process, advocates came together to urge increased investment and make the case for environmental investigations at that lower blood lead level. We're still in the budget process, but our advocacy was successful. Nurses and environmental services will both begin now at that lower blood lead level of 5 as resources become available. And as we work through the budget process, We are lucky that our state health department and advocates continue to work together to support this expansion. And finally, as I mentioned before, there is that complicated algorithm about when testing should happen and who should be tested. It's time-consuming and confusing for providers, and we believe a barrier for testing. We'll begin to explore whether or not the whole state should take a look at moving from targeted blood lead screening to universal testing for all women and children. Next. So what other policy changes might be on the horizon, and what can public health practitioners do? You might not think that brain research can influence housing policy, but we've seen that there are connections. Things like prospective rental inspection, for example, are good policy options for improving housing stock and protecting kids. The change in lead policy for us requiring housing inspection at lower blood lead levels means that more units will get inspected, will collect and use for surveillance purposes more housing data, and all of that will provide more opportunities to make the case with our municipal partners that prospective rental inspection will protect their residents. Some communities in Illinois are beginning to explore this, and we've seen evidence in other jurisdictions, like Maryland, with the work it's done around housing registries and Let's Safe Housing, for example, that those housing improvements can really make a difference for women and children. Amy has already talked about early intervention, and I'm going to turn it back to her to talk a little bit about WIC funds for blood lead testing. Next.
Thank you, Deanna. We're also thinking about improvements at the state level that are driven by federal WIC dollars. And we recently wrote a brief promoting the use of federal WIC funds for blood lead testing, water filters, and ready-to-feed formula. And you can access that issue brief at our website, and we've included the link here. Next. According to Child Trends, if children with previous exposure to lead do not receive appropriate early interventions, lead-related deficits can ripple through their entire lives. Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, the hero of Flint, advocates that, quote, we cannot sit back and wait 20 years to see the consequences of lead poisoning in our schools and in our criminal justice system. There are ways to mitigate damage, and we can do things now that can lessen the impact. This is a unique opportunity to build a model public health program, unquote. This is the model that we hope to build in Illinois and across the country. Next. Thank you, and we are available for any questions. Also, we've included a link to a variety of our early intervention and lead resources on this page, as well as our contact information. Thank you. We'll turn it back over to you all.
Sorry about that, some technical difficulties. I wanted to thank all of our speakers. We would now like to open it up for your questions. Please chat in your questions to the chat box if you've not done so already. And we will first start by asking some questions that have already come in.
So we received a few questions in the chat box. The first for presenters is, can you share any screening tools you've created?
Are these screening tools for medical providers? If so, there are the Illinois Department of Public Health screening tools are available at the Illinois Department of Public Health website. However, those are in the process of being updated. So if you do check now, you're getting kind of version 1.0. And if you check back in about a month, you'll get the 2.0 improved version that has been informed by some of the work we've been doing in that national collaborative to improve our screening in the state.
And we do have, for the screening tool, there is a child risk assessment questionnaire, and there's also one that is used prenatally for pregnant women. And both of them are being updated right now.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is, do you have an example of a medical intake form for school entry that specifically has a field to be completed for all blood lead levels?
We have a, so every state is different, but in Illinois for enrollment in preschool, childcare, and at kindergarten, 6th and 9th grade, all children have to have completed a certificate of child health. On that document, they are supposed to indicate that they have either been tested or screened for lead, and that's really all we have that's required to be provided by a school, and you can sort of understand that there are limitations around that because they're only during very specific periods of time that has to be submitted. And so a child could be exposed to lead at any in-between time.
Great, thank you. And we have one more question that came in. The question is, are there any childhood lead poisoning prevention programs that can report blood lead levels directly to EI?
So through our pilot, we are working to refer families to the early intervention system, and then we're able, when the family enrolls, we're able to work with the early intervention, the CFC practitioners in order to share the blood lead levels.
And what we think, is best practice, what we know is best practice in early intervention, regardless of what the referral is for the referring source to actually utilize a referral form. In Illinois, you can look it up. It's called the Standardized Illinois Early Intervention Referral Form. And that's really best practice in making a referral, because on it, you will be able to indicate the child's elevated blood lead level and any other concerns that you have. I think our document is a really nice model for other states. If you don't have a standardized EI referral form, I would highly recommend that you take a look at Illinois.
And the other thing just to note is that all of the states that Amy went over that already acknowledge lead as an automatic eligibility criteria for early intervention do accept referrals for elevated lead levels. Granted, those are at different levels and have different definitions, but in those specific states that she laid out, all medical providers should be able to refer to early intervention and at least get an evaluation.
So it'd be a good idea to contact your state program about how their referrals work.
Great, thank you so much. I also wanted to highlight that Teresa, thank you so much, shared a few resources on Maryland in the chat box. So I wanted to invite you all to go ahead and check those out and follow those links to find out more. And I wanted to give anyone else a last chance opportunity to type in the chat box. If you have any questions, please do so now as we wrap up the webinar. So again, I just wanted to thank everyone who joined today's webinar, especially our presenters and partners, and we invite you to visit our website, www.astho.org, to access the suite materials ASTHO developed and are intended to help state and territorial health leaders consider policies and practices that promote healthy early brain development. We also ask that you make sure to fill out our evaluation. The link is in the chat box as well as on the screen. And your feedback is very, very important to us. And as always, if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to anyone on the ASTHO team or myself, and we can help you with those. Finally, we invite you to join our colleagues on the health improvement team at ASTHO, who are hosting an ASTHOConnects series on brain health. The webinar is an opportunity to engage with experts from the national and state level about specific ways to incorporate brain health, Alzheimer's disease, and caregiving content into programs in your jurisdiction. Tools, examples, and practical tips will be provided, and speakers will be ready to answer questions that you submit in advance. We also invite you to go to www.astho.org/healthyaging to check out the newly released resource for communicating brain and heart health among American Indian and Alaska Native communities, including posters, flyers, provider guides, and short videos, as well as radio public service announcements. Again, ASTA would like to thank everyone who joined today's webinar, especially our presenters and partners. And as always, again, please feel free to reach out to our team with any questions. And we're ending a little bit early, so feel free to get 15 minutes back of your day and enjoy your lunch. Thank you.